I was standing in a Portsmouth courtroom when my half-brother pointed at me and said, "She's a liar. My father never had another daughter." The judge turned toward me slowly. I still remember the sound of the ceiling fan above us, the scratch of reporters' pens, the smell of old paper and coffee that had been sitting too long on a hot plate. Then the old man beside me, the dying admiral everyone in Portsmouth once feared, lifted his trembling hand and whispered 3 words that silenced the room. "She has Beatrice's eyes." That was the moment Julian Fairchild realized the truth was finally going to destroy him. But none of us started there. It started 3 months earlier on a rainy Thursday night while I was cleaning blood off my shoes in the emergency room at St. Mary's Hospital in Portsmouth. I was 42 years old then, divorced, no children, night shift ER nurse for nearly 15 years. I lived alone in a small brick terrace house outside Hambledon with a golden retriever named Gus and more unpaid bills than I liked admitting out loud. My life was ordinary, quiet, and until that phone call came, I believed that was all it would ever be. The ER had been chaos that night. 2 motorway accidents back to back, a teenager overdosing in the parking lot, one elderly man with chest pains who kept apologizing for being a bother. Near midnight, I finally sat down in the break room with stale coffee and half a turkey sandwich. That was when my mobile phone rang. Unknown number. I almost ignored it. "Althea Marsden," I answered tiredly. A calm male voice said, "Miss Marsden, my name is Lieutenant Commander James Holloway. I'm calling from the Royal Navy Legal Services." I frowned immediately. "I think you have the wrong person." "No, ma'am, I don't." There was a pause. Then he said the sentence that changed my life. "Admiral Edmund Fairchild is dying. He wants to see you." I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was absurd. "I think you're confused," I said. "My parents died when I was 6. The man on the phone grew quieter. "I understand why you believe that." Something cold moved through my chest. ER workers kept walking past the break room door behind me. Someone shouted for respiratory. Monitors beeped down the hallway, but suddenly all of it felt far away. "I don't know who this is," I told him carefully. "But I'm not interested in whatever game you're playing. It's not a game, Miss Marsden." "Then why would some admiral ask for me?" Another silence. Then softly, almost reluctantly, he answered, "Because he believes you're his daughter." I stood up so fast my chair nearly tipped over. My heart started hammering hard enough to hurt. "No," I said immediately. "No, absolutely not. Ma'am, you people need to stop calling me." Before he could answer, I hung up. For almost 10 minutes, I stood there staring at the vending machine without seeing it. My hands were shaking. I told myself it was nonsense, some scam, some mistake involving another Althea Marsden. But deep down, something had already cracked open. Because when you grow up in foster care, there's one secret pain you never fully bury. You always wonder if somebody lied to you. I hated myself for even thinking it. At 2:00 the morning, my shift ended. Rain hammered the parking garage roof while I walked to my car. I sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. Then I looked at my phone. 3 missed calls. Same number. God help me. I called back. Lieutenant Commander Holloway answered immediately like he'd been waiting beside the phone. "I'm listening," I said. That was all. Nothing more. He spoke gently after that, careful, professional. Admiral Edmund Fairchild had retired years earlier after serving as commander of the Home Fleet. Widower, 1 surviving son, serious heart failure, not expected to live much longer. And for the past 8 months, according to Holloway, the Admiral had been searching for me, how I asked numbly. He reopened old family records. "What family? Yours?" I gripped the steering wheel harder. "This doesn't make any sense." "I imagine it doesn't." "Why now?" His answer came quietly. "Because dying men tend to stop lying to themselves." I closed my eyes. Outside rain blurred the parking garage lights into long silver streaks. I should have gone home. Instead, I asked, "Where is he?" The estate sat outside Portsmouth on several acres overlooking the Solent. I drove there the next afternoon after almost no sleep. The closer I got, the angrier I became. I kept rehearsing what I would say. "You have the wrong person. Leave me alone. I don't want anything from you." The Fairchild mansion looked like something from another century. Massive white columns, gravel pathways, naval ensigns hanging near the entrance despite the rain. Money. Old money. The kind of wealth that decides judges and MPs belong at dinner parties. A housekeeper opened the front door before I even knocked. "You must be Althea," she said softly. "Not Miss Marsden." "Althea?" That unsettled me more than anything so far. The house smelled like lemon polish, old books, and fading flowers. Family portraits lined the walls. Naval uniforms, graduation photos, generations of people who belonged somewhere. I didn't belong there. Lieutenant Commander Holloway met me near the staircase. He was probably late 50s. Kind eyes, tired face. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I haven't agreed to anything." "I know." Upstairs, the hallway grew quieter. The bedroom door stood partially open. Machines beeped softly inside. And then I saw him, an old man lying weakly in a hospital bed beside tall windows overlooking gray water. His hair was nearly white, his face thin from illness. But the moment his eyes lifted toward mine, I stopped breathing because they were my eyes. Same shape, same color, same strange dark ring around the iris. The old man stared at me like he'd spent 40 years drowning, and finally reached air. Tears filled his eyes instantly. "My God," he whispered. I couldn't move. Couldn't think. The room tilted sideways. Then he said the words that shattered my entire life. "You look just like your mother." I should have walked out. Maybe a smarter woman would have. Instead, I stepped closer to the bed like somebody moving through a dream. And on the nightstand beside him sat an old framed photograph. A younger version of the Admiral stood beside a smiling woman holding a little girl with dark eyes. My eyes. I didn't touch the photograph. I just stood there staring at it while every memory I trusted started falling apart inside my head. The little girl in the picture couldn't have been older than 5. Dark curls, red raincoat, missing front tooth. I still had that same crooked smile and childhood photos from foster care. Only now I realized those photos had started after that picture was taken. Not before. The old man in the bed watched me carefully, like he was afraid one wrong movement might make me disappear again. "Althea," he whispered. Hearing my name in his voice made something twist painfully in my chest. I stepped back immediately. "No," I said. "Don't do that." His eyes closed briefly. "I know I don't deserve. You don't deserve anything from me." The words came out sharper than I intended, but I didn't take them back. Lieutenant Commander Holloway quietly left the room, closing the door behind him. Now it was just me and the dying stranger who apparently shared my face. Rain tapped softly against the windows overlooking the Solent. "You need to explain this," I demanded. Edmund Fairchild looked older than any man I'd ever seen up close. Not physically, spiritually. Like life had been grinding him down for decades. "I tried to find you," he said weakly. I almost laughed again. That's funny because I spent 36 years believing I was abandoned. Pain crossed his face so deeply that for one terrible second, I believed him. "I never abandoned you." "Then where were you?" His hand trembled against the blanket. "They took you from me." I folded my arms immediately, defensive, angry, confused enough to feel sick. "Who took me?" But before he could answer, the bedroom door opened. A tall man in an expensive gray suit walked inside carrying a tablet and 2 folders. He stopped cold when he saw me, and the look on his face told me one thing instantly. He already knew exactly who I was. He recovered quickly, though. Rich people always do. "You must be Althea," he said smoothly. Edmund's expression hardened. "This isn't the time, Julian." "Julian?" His son. My stomach tightened. The man gave me a polite smile that never reached his eyes. "I'm Julian Fairchild, half-brother." Even thinking the word made my skin crawl. Julian looked about 50. Silver at the temples, perfect posture, country club confidence, the kind of man who probably belonged to 3 yacht clubs and complained when wine was served at the wrong temperature. But underneath that polished appearance, I saw something else. Fear. He was afraid of me. That realization grounded me fast. "I was just leaving," I said. Edmund struggled to sit up slightly. "Please don't." Julian stepped closer to the bed. "Father, your cardiologist said you need rest." Edmund ignored him completely. Instead, he looked only at me. "They lied to both of us," he said quietly. I wanted to believe I didn't care, but every foster home flashed through my mind at once. Every birthday, nobody came. Every Christmas, I pretended not to hope. Every school form asking for family medical history I didn't have. You build armor around that kind of pain. Then one sentence cracks it open. "Who lied?" I asked. Julian answered before Edmund could. "This really isn't the place for complicated family history?" I turned toward him sharply. You knew about me. His expression barely changed. My father mentioned possibilities over the years. Possibilities like I was a rumor, not a person. Edmund suddenly coughed hard into a handkerchief. The sound rattled deep in his chest. For a moment, all the anger left the room. He looked fragile, human, mortal. I hated that part most of all, because monsters are easier to walk away from than broken old men. The housekeeper entered quietly with tea. She set the tray down beside me without speaking, but before leaving, she touched my arm gently. I'm glad you came, she whispered. Not polite, not formal, emotional, like she'd been waiting years to say it. That scared me more than anything else. I stayed another hour. Not because I forgave him, not because I trusted him. I stayed because I needed answers more than I needed pride. Edmund talked slowly between exhausted breaths. Small pieces at first. My mother's name was Beatrice Langford Fairchild. She died from ovarian cancer when I was 6. After her death, according to Edmund, her father blamed him for everything. You were all I had left, he said. So why didn't you keep me? His eyes filled again. I tried. That was all he said. Every time I pushed harder. Julian interrupted. Father needs rest. Perhaps another day. We shouldn't overwhelm Althea. By the third interruption, I realized something important. Julian did not want me alone with Edmund, not even for 10 minutes. When I finally stood to leave, Edmund looked panicked. Will you come back? I hesitated too long before answering. I don't know. The truth was I already felt trapped because if he was lying, I needed proof. And if he wasn't, then somebody had stolen my entire childhood. Downstairs, Holloway walked me to the front door. Did you know I asked him? He nodded carefully for a few years, and nobody thought maybe I deserved to know. His face tightened with guilt. The Admiral feared legal complications. I stared at him in disbelief. Legal complications. Your grandfather was a very powerful man. My grandfather, Charles Beaumont. The name meant nothing to me then. It would later. In Hampshire political circles, Charles Beaumont had once been treated like royalty. Banking money, parliamentary connections, charity boards, judges at dinner parties, the kind of family that buried scandals instead of surviving them. I stepped out onto the porch. The rain had finally stopped. The Solent stretched gray and endless beyond the trees. You should know something, Holloway said behind me. I turned. The Admiral reopened your case 8 months ago. Case? He found sealed court records. A cold feeling crept through me again. What records? Holloway hesitated, then quietly said the words that followed me all the way home. The records say your father lost custody of you. I barely slept that night. I sat at my kitchen table until dawn with old foster paperwork spread around me. Most of it was incomplete. Missing signatures, missing medical history, missing years. At 6:00 the morning, I found something I'd never paid attention to before. My intake documents from Hampshire Children's Services listed me as Althea Beaumont Marsden, not Althea Marsden. Beaumont. I stared at the paper until the letters blurred. Then I noticed something handwritten in faded blue ink across the bottom corner. Family transfer authorized by C. Beaumont. My hand started shaking so badly I dropped the file onto the floor. And for the first time in my life, I realized something terrifying. I had never been orphaned at all. I called out sick the next day for the first time in almost 4 years. My supervisor, Diane, sounded genuinely worried. You all right, Em? Yeah, I lied. Just haven't slept. That part at least was true. I spent the morning sitting at my kitchen table with 36 years of paperwork spread around me like evidence from somebody else's murder, because that's what it felt like. Like somebody had killed my old life overnight. The faded county forms, foster intake reports, school transfers, medical records with blank family history sections. Every page suddenly looked suspicious. And one name kept appearing over and over again. C. Beaumont. Sometimes as a signature, sometimes as an authorization, once as an emergency contact. Not father, not grandfather, just initials. Like I was some problem being managed quietly. By noon, I drove to the Hampshire Records office. The building smelled exactly like every government office smells: dust, old paper, stale air conditioning, and burned coffee. A gray-haired clerk wearing bifocals helped me search archived family court records. At first, nothing appeared. Then she frowned at her computer screen. That's odd. What? She adjusted her glasses. Your file's restricted. Restricted by who? She clicked twice more. I can't access it from this terminal. I stared at her. You're telling me my childhood records are sealed. Looks that way. For what reason? She gave me a sympathetic look. Older women sometimes give younger women carrying visible pain. Honey, these records were sealed in 1988 by direct judicial order, the year I disappeared into foster care. My stomach turned. Can I appeal it? You'd need a solicitor. I almost laughed at that. Of course I would. By the time I walked back outside, cold wind was blowing through downtown Hambledon. I sat inside my car, gripping the steering wheel, trying to breathe normally. Then my phone rang. Julian Fairchild. I nearly ignored it, but anger answered for me. What? His voice sounded smooth and controlled, like a man trained never to sweat publicly. I thought we should speak privately. I don't. I think you do. I almost hung up. Then he said, there are things about my father you don't understand. That stopped me because all my life, powerful people had decided what I did or didn't deserve to know. I was tired of it. We met at a waterfront restaurant near Portsmouth that afternoon. The kind of place retired MPs probably loved. White tablecloths, seafood worth 40 pounds, sailboats bobbing outside tall windows. Julian stood when I approached. Perfect manners, perfect suit, perfect smile. I already disliked him deeply. I appreciate you coming, he said. I almost didn't. We sat. A waitress appeared immediately, like she'd been trained to recognize wealthy regulars. Julian ordered black coffee. I asked for nothing. For a moment, he simply studied me. The resemblance unsettled him. I could tell. You have her face, he said quietly. My mother. He nodded once. That irritated me more than it should have because he had memories of her. I had nothing. What exactly do you want? I asked. Julian folded his hands carefully. My father is very ill. Emotional decisions are affecting his judgment. There it is. His jaw tightened slightly. I'm trying to avoid unnecessary damage. To who? Our family. I leaned back slowly. You mean your inheritance? His polite mask cracked for half a second. Not much, but enough. You appeared very suddenly, he said. I stared at him in disbelief. Suddenly? From our perspective? Yes, your perspective, I said sharply. I was 6 years old. People nearby had started quietly listening. Julian lowered his voice. My grandfather believed my father was unstable after my mother died. There it is again, I said. What? Everybody talking about me like I was paperwork. Something flickered behind his eyes then. Guilt, only a flash. But I saw it. I pressed harder immediately. You knew about me before yesterday. No, that's a lie. He looked away toward the harbor. That tiny movement told me everything. I suddenly remembered all those years growing up, wondering why nobody came for me. Meanwhile, somewhere nearby, this man had known I existed. Rage climbed slowly into my chest. You knew? I repeated quietly. Julian rubbed his jaw. My father mentioned you years ago. Mentioned me? He became obsessed after my mother died. I froze. Your mother? Julian nodded. My mother was Eleanor Fairchild. Father remarried. The realization hit hard. I wasn't just hidden from one family. There had been an entirely separate life happening without me. Vacations, birthdays, Christmas mornings, graduations, a whole family tree growing while I sat in foster homes pretending not to care when other children got adopted. You had him, I whispered. Julian looked uncomfortable for the first time. He wasn't easy to live with, I laughed bitterly. You know what's funny? That's still better than having nobody. Silence settled between us. Outside, gulls drifted low over the gray water. Finally, Julian sighed. My grandfather believed he was protecting the family by stealing a child. He thought father's military trauma made him dangerous. I stared at him. Did you believe that? Julian didn't answer immediately, and that silence told me no. He never believed it. Not really. So, what happened? I asked quietly. Julian's shoulders sagged slightly like he was tired of carrying something heavy. There was a custody battle after Beatrice died, he admitted. My grandfather had connections. Judges, solicitors, people owed him favors, and Edmund lost. Yes. Then what? Julian looked down at his coffee. You disappeared. Something about the way he said it bothered me. Not sadness. Avoidance. Careful wording. You make it sound accidental. His eyes met mine again, and for the first time, I saw fear clearly. Not of scandal, of truth. Before I could press further, his phone buzzed. He checked it immediately. Father's asking for you. I almost refused. Instead. 2 hours later, I found myself back at the Fairchild mansion. This time, Edmund was awake and sitting near the windows wrapped in a navy blanket. The late afternoon sun lit the Solent behind him. For a moment, he didn't look like an admiral, just an old, lonely man. When he saw me, emotion filled his face so quickly it nearly broke me. You came back. I stayed standing. I found the court records. His eyes closed briefly. Then he whispered, I prayed you never would. Why? Because I knew what it would cost you. Anger exploded out of me before I could stop it. It already cost me everything. Edmund flinched hard, and suddenly I hated myself a little because underneath all the confusion and fury, I realized something awful. He looked exactly like a father who'd been grieving for decades. 3 days later, my face was on local television. Not the main evening news. Not yet. Just one of those afternoon regional segments people watch in waiting rooms and barbershops. The headline at the bottom of the screen read, Mystery Woman Appears in Admiral's Final Days. I stood in my kitchen holding a cup of coffee gone cold while a smiling anchorwoman speculated about possible estate complications. Then they showed a photograph of me walking into the Fairchild estate. Somebody had been waiting with the camera. I turned the television off immediately. 5 minutes later, my phone started ringing. Coworkers, friends I barely talked to anymore. One reporter even left a voicemail asking whether I was the Admiral's secret daughter. Secret daughter as if I were an affair instead of a child. I sat down at the kitchen table feeling humiliated in a way I hadn't since foster care. Because when you grow up, unwanted public shame hits differently. It reopens old wounds fast. By evening, I was seriously considering disappearing again. Then Edmund called personally. His breathing sounded weak over the phone. I'm sorry, he said. For what? For Julian. I went quiet. Edmund coughed painfully before continuing. He's trying to protect himself. That's supposed to make me feel better. No, he admitted softly, but it's the truth. Part of me wanted to scream at him. Another part heard genuine exhaustion in his voice. I didn't ask for any of this, I whispered. I know. Your family's treating me like a thief. Long silence. Then Edmund said something I never expected. You sound exactly like your mother when she was angry. That hurt more than it should have. Because every mention of Beatrice felt like being shown pieces of a life stolen from me. What was she like? I asked quietly. I heard him smile through the phone. She laughed loudly in church. Despite everything, I almost smiled too. She hated expensive restaurants, loved roadside cafes, collected old records, could never keep plants alive. The details hit me hard. Real things, human things, not the fantasy version of a dead mother I'd built in my head. Edmund kept talking slowly, carefully as though afraid I'd hang up. She used to sing while cooking, always off-key. I sat there in silence listening to the father I never knew, describe the mother I barely remembered. And for the first time, this stopped feeling like a scandal. It started feeling like grief. The next morning, I drove to Portsmouth again. Not because I trusted anyone, because I needed the truth before the newspapers buried it beneath gossip. Lieutenant Commander Holloway met me in Edmund's study instead of the bedroom this time. The room smelled like leather, cedar wood, and old paper. Naval awards covered entire walls, framed photographs with prime ministers, foreign dignitaries, military ceremonies. But the thing that caught my attention wasn't any of that. It was a faded pink bicycle in the corner. Tiny, child-sized. I stared at it. Edmund noticed immediately. You loved that bike, he said softly. My chest tightened painfully. I don't remember it. You used to ride circles through this house until your mother yelled. His eyes drifted toward the bicycle like a man looking at a ghost. I kept thinking someday you'd come back for it. I had to look away because suddenly revenge didn't feel clean anymore. It felt sad. Holloway handed me a thick folder. These are copies of the original custody filings. My hands shook slightly taking them. Inside were psychiatric evaluations claiming Edmund suffered violent combat instability after returning from deployment. aggressive tendencies, emotional unpredictability, potential danger to a minor child. I looked up slowly. These are fake. Edmund gave a bitter smile. Not entirely. I drank too much after Beatrice died. That doesn't make you dangerous. No, he said quietly, but it made me vulnerable. I kept reading witness statements, character concerns, judicial recommendations. Every page painted him as unstable. Then I saw the judge's signature, Harold Benton. The name meant nothing to me. But Holloway leaned forward. Judge Benton retired 2 years later and joined Beaumont Financial Holdings as legal counsel. I stared at him. You're kidding. I wish I were. Something inside me hardened then. Not toward Edmund. Toward the people who engineered this. People with money, connections, influence. They hadn't just won custody. They erased a human being. Edmund suddenly pulled open a desk drawer beside him. From inside, he removed dozens of returned letters tied with faded ribbon. All addressed to you, he said. My throat closed instantly. I untied one carefully. Every envelope had been returned unopened. No forwarding address. Some were birthday cards. Some Christmas letters. One simply read, I saw a little girl at the harbor today wearing yellow rain boots. For one terrible second, I thought it was you. My vision blurred. They told me you were moved constantly, Edmund whispered. I hired investigators, lawyers, anyone who would help. Why didn't you go public? The shame on his face answered before his words did. Because Charles Beaumont threatened to destroy everyone around me. I looked up sharply. What does that mean? Edmund hesitated too long. Finally, he said quietly. He threatened your mother's reputation. Silence filled the study. Older Britons understand this kind of power better than younger people do. Back then, wealthy families protected appearances at all costs. Mental illness, alcohol problems, custody scandals, everything stayed buried. And people like Charles Beaumont knew exactly how to weaponize shame. I suddenly realized Edmund hadn't only lost me, he lost publicly. That kind of humiliation destroys men from his generation. A knock interrupted us. Julian entered without waiting. The moment he saw the letters in my hands, his expression changed. Not surprise. Alarm, father, he said sharply. You shouldn't be exhausting yourself. Edmund's voice turned cold instantly. Leave. Julian ignored him. Instead, he looked directly at me. You should understand something before believing every story you hear. I stood slowly. What story would that be? His jaw tightened. My father was not innocent in all this. Edmund's breathing grew rougher. I said, leave. But Julian kept talking. You think you're the only one hurt here? He disappeared into the Navy for 20 years after you vanished. I barely had a father either. The room went still because for the first time, I heard genuine resentment in Julian's voice. Not greed, not arrogance, pain. And suddenly this family tragedy became larger than me, larger than inheritance. It was generations of people destroying one another while pretending they were protecting family honor. Julian looked at the letters again, then quietly said the sentence that changed everything. You still haven't told her what happened the night she disappeared. Edmund went pale. The room felt smaller after Julian said it. Even the air changed. Edmund stared at his son with a kind of exhausted fury I'd never seen before. Get out, he whispered. But Julian stood his ground. No, he said quietly. Not this time. I looked between them, suddenly aware that whatever came next had been poisoning this family for decades. What happened? I asked. Neither man answered immediately. Outside the tall study windows, the Solent looked cold and gray beneath heavy clouds. Somewhere downstairs, a clock chimed 4 times. Finally, Edmund closed his eyes. The night you disappeared, he said weakly, I came here to take you home. Every muscle in my body tightened. He motioned toward the chair across from him. I sat slowly. Julian stayed near the doorway, arms folded tightly across his chest. Edmund's voice sounded distant now, like he was speaking from another lifetime. Your grandfather invited me to dinner. Said he wanted peace after months of court hearings. Charles Beaumont, I said. Edmund nodded once. He told me he'd reconsidered everything. Said, you deserved your father. A bitter laugh escaped Julian. Edmund ignored him. I believed him, he continued. God help me. I believed him. The old Admiral stared toward the water while speaking. I arrived here around 7 that evening. You were upstairs asleep. Beatrice's old room. I remember hearing sea wind against the windows. His breathing roughened slightly. Dinner lasted less than an hour before Beaumont started drinking heavily. Then he began insulting Beatrice, blaming me for her death. Julian looked uncomfortable hearing that. Edmund continued anyway. He said, I destroyed his daughter, destroyed the family name. Destroyed you. What happened next? I whispered. Edmund's eyes darkened. I told him I was taking you home immediately. Silence stretched. Then he refused. The study felt unbearably quiet. He claimed the judge was preparing emergency action to suspend my custody rights permanently, said military command already questioned my mental fitness. I looked at Holloway, who stood quietly near the bookshelf listening. His expression confirmed everything. Edmund rubbed shaking hands together slowly. I went upstairs to get you anyway. His voice cracked slightly there. When I entered the bedroom, you were gone. A chill ran down my spine. What do you mean gone? Edmund swallowed hard. The bed was empty. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. I searched the house, he whispered. Every room, every hallway. His eyes filled again. Then Beaumont's security men physically removed me from the property. I stared at him in disbelief. You called the police? Yes. What happened? A terrible smile crossed his face. The police chief played golf with Charles Beaumont. That sentence told me more about old British money than any history book ever could. Julian finally spoke quietly. My grandfather claimed you'd suffered a breakdown. Edmund nodded bitterly. He told everyone I'd become violent, and people believed him. Some did, Edmund admitted. Some pretended to. The room went silent again. I tried imagining myself at 6 years old, scared, confused, taken somewhere without explanation. Then I imagined a father pounding on locked doors while powerful men calmly buried the truth. Rage moved through me slowly now, not explosive, cold, dangerous. What actually happened to me? I asked. Nobody answered immediately. Then Holloway stepped forward, carrying another folder. We recently uncovered transportation records, he said carefully. My stomach dropped. Transportation. Your grandfather transferred legal guardianship temporarily through a private family agency. I stared at him. You mean they shipped me away? No one corrected me. Holloway handed me copies of old records. Portsmouth, Brighton, Bristol, Manchester. 4 foster placements in 2 years, like cargo. I suddenly remembered strange pieces of childhood I'd buried for years. Different bedrooms, different churches, different women brushing my hair. A social worker once telling me, you'll stop crying eventually. I had stopped. That was the worst part. Children adapt to abandonment because they have to. I looked at Edmund. You knew where I was. Sometimes he admitted painfully. But every time my solicitors pushed custody, Beaumont intervened. How? He had judges delaying hearings, records sealed, investigators blocked. Julian rubbed both hands over his face heavily. My grandfather was obsessed with reputation, he muttered. I turned toward him sharply. And you? His eyes met mine. For once, no polished mask. Just shame. I was 14 when I found your letters, he admitted quietly. Edmund looked up immediately. You told me you never saw them. Julian nodded slowly. I lied. The words hit the room like broken glass. My chest tightened painfully. You knew I existed all those years. Julian's voice lowered almost to a whisper. Yes. Why? He looked toward the Solon instead of me because I was angry. Edmund stared at him in disbelief. At a child? No. Julian snapped suddenly at you. The emotion in his voice startled all of us. You disappeared after Beatrice died, he said to Edmund. You buried yourself in deployments and Navy politics while I grew up in this mausoleum listening to grandfather talk about honor every day. Edmund looked devastated. Julian laughed bitterly. And then suddenly there were letters to another daughter, another child you couldn't let go of. I realized then that Julian had spent decades competing with the ghost of a missing little girl. Not for money, for love. That didn't excuse what he'd done, but it made him human. I told myself keeping the letters hidden protected the family, Julian said hoarsely. Truth is, I didn't want to lose what little father I had left. Silence filled the room. Edmund looked older by the second. You stole 30 years from her, he whispered. Julian's eyes finally met mine. and from him, he admitted. For the first time since meeting him, I saw genuine remorse. Not enough to erase anything, but real. A soft knock interrupted us. The housekeeper entered carrying tea. When she saw our faces, she immediately understood something terrible had surfaced. She quietly set the tray down. Then she looked at me gently. "I used to sneak your father updates whenever I could," she said softly. I blinked. "What?" She nodded sadly. "Your grandfather fired anyone who mentioned your name, but some of us remembered. How long have you worked here?" 41 years. Long enough to watch an entire family destroy itself. I suddenly felt exhausted beyond words. Not dramatic exhaustion, old exhaustion. The kind people carry after years of grief. I looked around the study filled with military awards and polished wood and expensive paintings. None of it mattered. All that money, all that influence, and these people still ended up lonely. Edmund suddenly pressed a trembling hand against his chest. Holloway moved instantly. "Sir." The Admiral's breathing became shallow. Machines nearby began beeping faster. I stood frozen while Holloway called for medical staff downstairs. But through all the chaos, Edmund kept staring only at me, terrified. Not of dying, of losing me again. And in that moment, I realized something dangerous. I no longer wanted revenge against a dying old man. I wanted revenge against everyone who taught him love could be taken away by power. The courthouse in Portsmouth smelled like rain-soaked wool coats and old wood polish. I remember that clearly. Funny the things people remember on the worst day of their lives. Not the cameras outside. Not the reporters shouting questions. Not even the pain. I remembered an elderly bailiff offering me a paper cup of coffee because my hands were shaking too badly to hide it. "You all right, ma'am?" he asked gently. I nodded even though I wasn't. That morning, every television station in Hampshire seemed to know my name. Admiral's secret daughter files court action. Some outlets treated it like scandal. Others treated it like tragedy. A few treated it like entertainment. That part disgusted me most because once rich families implode publicly, Britain turns it into theater. But none of those reporters understood what this courtroom actually held. Not inheritance, not money, 40 years of stolen life. I sat beside Holloway at the plaintiff's table while solicitors shuffled paperwork around us. Julian sat across the aisle with his legal team. For the first time since meeting him, he looked tired, not polished, not powerful, just tired, and strangely older. The courtroom slowly filled with observers, retired Navy officers, local reporters, curious Portsmouth socialites hungry for gossip. Then the side door opened. Everyone turned. Edmund Fairchild entered in a wheelchair pushed by a Navy medic. The entire room changed instantly. Even sick and frail. The man carried gravity. Old military men straightened unconsciously when he passed. Some nodded respectfully. Others looked away awkwardly as if witnessing a legend become mortal was too painful. Edmund looked directly at me first. Only me, and despite everything, something inside me steadied. The hearing began quietly. No dramatic television speeches. Real courtrooms rarely work that way. Mostly paperwork, arguments over sealed records, procedural motions, but underneath all that legal language sat something raw and human. Who gets to decide whether a parent deserves their child? Julian's solicitor spoke first. A polished London lawyer with silver cufflinks and a voice built for expensive billing hours. Miss Marsden's sudden appearance, he began carefully raises significant concerns regarding estate manipulation during a period of declining medical capacity. Manipulation. I almost laughed like I'd spent decades planning some elaborate inheritance scheme while working night shifts and clipping grocery coupons. Holloway leaned toward me slightly. "Stay calm," he whispered. Easy advice from someone whose childhood hadn't been auctioned off through family court. Our solicitor, Margaret Levin, stood slowly. She had to be nearly 70 herself. Sharp-eyed, no nonsense. The kind of older woman who terrified arrogant men politely. "Your Honor," she said evenly, "we possess evidence proving Miss Marsden was intentionally separated from her biological father through fraudulent legal interference that got the courtroom's attention fast." The judge adjusted his glasses. "What kind of interference?" Margaret opened a thick folder. "Bribery, political coercion, falsified psychiatric evaluations." Murmurs spread immediately. Julian stared forward without moving, but I saw the muscle tighten in his jaw. Margaret continued calmly. We also possess testimony from former employees of Charles Beaumont, confirming deliberate obstruction of custody enforcement. The judge looked toward Julian's solicitors. Was the Fairchild family aware of these allegations previously? Julian finally spoke himself. Yes. His voice sounded, not confident anymore, just exhausted. The courtroom quieted immediately. Even reporters stopped typing. Margaret turned toward him carefully. Mr. Fairchild, when did you first become aware Althea Marsden existed? Long silence. Julian swallowed hard. When I was 14. A wave of whispers rolled through the courtroom. I stared at him. Even after everything, hearing him admit it publicly still hurt. Margaret didn't let up. And what did you do with that information? Julian closed his eyes briefly. Nothing. Why? His answer came so softly the courtroom almost missed it. Because I was afraid. That surprised everyone, including me. Margaret stepped closer. Afraid of what? Julian looked toward his father, losing him. Silence. Heavy silence. Older people understand something younger generations sometimes miss. Families don't usually collapse from one evil decision. They collapse from fear. Fear of shame, fear of abandonment, fear of losing love. The judge leaned forward carefully. Mr. Fairchild, are you admitting you concealed evidence related to Miss Marsden's identity? Julian nodded once. Yes. My chest tightened painfully. Not victory, grief. Because hearing truth out loud doesn't heal decades automatically. It only makes the wound undeniable. Then Margaret called the next witness. Harold Benton, the retired judge, the man who signed away my childhood. The entire room stiffened when he entered. Age had reduced him physically. Bent shoulders, trembling hands, oxygen tube beneath his nose, but his voice still carried authority when sworn in. Margaret approached him gently. Judge Benton, did Charles Beaumont ever contact you privately regarding the Fairchild custody case? The old man stared down at his hands for a very long time. Finally, he answered, yes. The room erupted instantly. The judge slammed his gavel for order. Margaret continued carefully. Did Mr. Beaumont offer financial incentives connected to your ruling? Benton looked like he might collapse. Yes, another explosion of whispers. I sat frozen, realizing my entire life had been redirected by men drinking whiskey behind closed doors decades earlier. Margaret's voice softened. Why are you admitting this now? The old judge looked toward me and suddenly he no longer resembled power. Just regret, because he whispered. I've had 40 years to think about what I did to that little girl. I couldn't breathe for a second. The courtroom blurred. I remembered foster homes, bin bags carrying my clothes, birthdays, nobody remembered, all because powerful men protected each other. Then Edmund unexpectedly asked to speak. The judge hesitated before allowing it. The Admiral struggled visibly just to lift his head. But when he spoke, the entire courtroom listened. I failed my daughter, he said weakly. No, I whispered instinctively. He looked at me with tears in his eyes. I should have burned the whole world down to find you. The honesty in that sentence shattered me completely, because finally, after all these years, I understood something. He never stopped grieving me. Not once. Margaret touched my arm gently. Althea, she whispered. Do you wish to address the court? I stood slowly. My knees barely worked. Every face in the room turned toward me. Reporters, lawyers, strangers. But I only looked at Edmund. I didn't come here for money, I said quietly. My voice shook at first, then steadied. I came because my entire life I believed nobody wanted me. The courtroom went silent, and now I find out my father spent 40 years searching for a daughter powerful people convinced him he'd lost forever. Several people wiped their eyes. Even the court reporter paused briefly. I looked toward Julian then, and fear destroyed all of us. Nobody spoke afterward because there was nothing left to say. Edmund came home from the hospital 2 weeks later. Home? Not the mansion. That word mattered to him now. The doctors had done everything they could after the courtroom collapsed, but everyone understood the truth without saying it directly. The Admiral was dying, not dramatically. Not television dying, quiet dying. The kind older people recognize immediately because they've seen it before in parents, spouses, brothers, and old friends. The body simply begins letting go. By then, the media frenzy had reached its peak. National outlets picked up the story. Editorials questioned family court corruption. Veterans groups publicly defended Edmund. Old Hampshire political names suddenly stopped returning phone calls. Charles Beaumont had been dead nearly 10 years, but his reputation was collapsing anyway. Funny how truth eventually digs its way upward like roots breaking through concrete. I stopped watching the news. None of it mattered anymore because while the public argued about scandal and inheritance, my father struggled just to walk from his bedroom to the porch. That became my world instead. Mornings helping him take medication, afternoons sorting through old photographs, evenings sitting beside the Solent, listening to gulls and distant boat engines while the sun lowered itself into gray water. Quiet things, real things. The mansion no longer felt intimidating to me. It felt lonely. Too many rooms built for appearances instead of living. One afternoon, I found Edmund in the kitchen trying unsuccessfully to make grilled cheese sandwiches. Smoke filled the room. The skillet was black, and the former commander of the home fleet looked genuinely confused by butter. I burst out laughing before I could stop myself. Edmund stared at the ruined sandwich. "Your mother always said I was helpless in kitchens. That you could have burned the whole house down," I told him. He smiled faintly. Wouldn't be the first military disaster tied to my name. That dry Navy humor appeared more often now, especially when he got tired. I remade the sandwiches while he sat at the table watching me quietly. Finally, he asked, "Do you hate me?" The question hurt because of how honestly he asked it, not defensively. Not self-pitying, just afraid. I placed his plate down carefully before answering. "I hated the idea of you." He nodded slowly like he understood. "But now," he asked. I sat across from him. The late afternoon sunlight made him look older than ever. Frail hands, thin shoulders, oxygen tube beneath his nose. A dying man searching my face for forgiveness. I think I said slowly, "I hate what happened to us more than I hate you." Tears filled his eyes immediately. He looked down at the table, unable to speak for a moment. "You have no idea." He whispered, "How many nights I prayed to hear you say something like that." Neither of us talked after that. We just ate burnt grilled cheese quietly while gulls cried outside the windows. And somehow that small, ordinary moment healed more than the courtroom ever did. A few days later, we visited my mother's grave together. Beatrice Fairchild. The headstone sat beneath an old oak tree in a small church cemetery outside Portsmouth. Edmund walked slowly with a cane while I carried flowers. Cold autumn wind moved through the branches overhead. "She loved this place," he said softly. I knelt to brush leaves away from the stone. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then Edmund quietly admitted something that changed how I understood him forever. "After you disappeared," he said, "I stopped knowing how to be a father." I looked up slowly. I buried myself in the Navy because it was the only thing I still understood. His eyes stayed fixed on the grave. Ships followed orders. Missions made sense. War had rules. He swallowed hard. "But losing you?" His voice broke. That was chaos. Older men from his generation rarely talk about emotions directly, especially military men, which meant every word cost him something. "I thought if I became important enough," he continued quietly, "I could someday force the world to give you back." I stared at him. All those medals, all those promotions, all that prestige, not ambition, grief. I suddenly understood something devastating. My father spent 40 years trying to outrank helplessness, and it never worked. That night, Julian came to the mansion unexpectedly. The housekeeper looked nervous, letting him inside. Honestly, so did I. He appeared thinner than before, less polished, like sleep had abandoned him for weeks. Edmund had already gone upstairs to rest. Julian stood awkwardly near the fireplace while I remained across the room. Neither of us knew how to begin. "Finally," he said, "I resigned from Beaumont Financial this morning." I blinked. "What?" the board asked quietly. I agreed loudly. There was bitterness in that sentence, but relief too. He rubbed his face tiredly. "I spent my whole life protecting a family image that destroyed everyone in it." I didn't answer because part of me still wanted to scream at him for the letters, for the silence, for knowing I existed while I sat alone in foster care, wondering why nobody came. Julian looked around the massive room. "You know what's strange?" he said softly. "None of this feels important anymore." I crossed my arms. "So, why are you here?" He looked directly at me then, and for the first time since we met, there was no performance in him, no polished air, no defensive sun, just regret. "I came because I owed you the truth." Silence settled heavily between us. Julian's voice lowered. "I used to hear Father crying sometimes after everyone went to sleep, My chest tightened immediately. He'd sit in this house holding your old photographs for hours. Julian swallowed hard. And I hated you for that. The honesty stunned me. Why? Because even gone, you were the only person he never stopped loving openly. That sentence stayed between us a long time. Then Julian whispered the words, I never expected to hear from him. I'm sorry, Althea. Not polished, not strategic, real. And somehow that made forgiveness harder instead of easier. Because monsters are simple. Broken people aren't. Later that night, I sat beside Edmund's bed while rain tapped softly against the windows. He woke briefly around midnight, confused at first. Then he saw me sitting there and smiled. You stayed, he whispered. I took his frail hand carefully. Yes, I said. His eyes drifted closed again. Just before sleep carried him away, he whispered one final sentence. You were always my little,